been a move to make it illegal to conduct evictions under level 3 of the lockdown, as the regulations during level 5 and level 4 of the lockdown also made it illegal to conduct evictions. Several claims over the last few days that landlords are evicting tenants at the moment. Of course, there are many people renting property who haven't been able to work and so cannot pay their rent. Landlords would argue that they don't want to lose their properties if they still have them mortgaged to a bank. Kumar is the Executive Director at the Development Action Group. Good afternoon to you. Thank you for your time. Why should evictions be illegal under lockdown level 3?
Thanks, Stephen, for having me on the show. So, the eviction issue is a complicated one. And under level 4, the National Department had put a moratorium on evictions. Under level 3, the evictions can be sought through a court order. And this is obviously very contentious because there's a huge amount of socio-economic impact on tenants, and tenants are generally facing a crisis in terms of being able to pay their rent. At the similar level, many of the landlords are experiencing, like you just said, are experiencing a loss of income, and as a consequence are evicting people. Now, there is just no avenue at the moment in terms of state being able to provide alternative accommodation in the kind of crisis that we're facing at the moment. People left on the street and homeless do not have any other avenues, and as a consequence, we do not think it's a good idea to pursue evictions at this particular moment. Obviously, this has to be linked into bigger discussions, Stephen. The big issue is really about urban land reform and urban land. This has to be discussed in the context of how the state land is made available for people that either might get evicted or have other options available through the current land that's owned by the state.
Okay, I'm going to come to that in a moment because it's a much bigger issue, as you say, and one that if you gave us 3 hours, we still wouldn't come even anywhere close to touching all of it. I do want to just sort of focus on the current situation, right? So you've got a landlord, you have a tenant, you have a contract between them. Almost none of the contracts that I've come across have taken into account, have predicted a pandemic or an act of God or force majeure or whatever you want to call it, right? So you have this legal instrument. Judges involved in eviction cases can't rewrite the legal instrument. They can't sort of, the contract just doesn't account for it. I've been struggling to think, is there any legal remedy that could come from government? I can't see it. The only thing you could really do is kind of wish 2020 away, and we can't do that.
Yeah, that's definitely not an option. But I think, there are many organizations that are spearheading with the presidency to say that there should be a moratorium on evictions under level 3 as well. Because it's really, like I said, it's just not feasible at the moment to face large-scale evictions on the ground, and where do the people go? And given the risks of the pandemic, there's a larger risk that people will contract COVID-19, and as a consequence, the health repercussions of something like that will be catastrophic.
For a landlord, to carry out an eviction, they technically, well, not technically, by law, they need a court order, right? That process should allow a tenant to say that I don't have an alternative accommodation. If I remember the Prevention of Illegal Eviction Act properly, you actually do have to have, as a landlord, you can't make someone homeless. You have to provide alternative accommodation. Is that the process that's being followed, or is something happening that's outside the law at the moment?
Well, there's multiple markets here, Stephen. In the formal market, yes, you require a court order, and then it becomes the responsibility either of the landlord or the state to provide alternative accommodation. The real issue when it comes in backyard properties where very, very low-income tenants are living on properties that are historically your RDP type of houses. And in those particular instances, neither are there legal protections nor are there lease agreements and so on. A similar thing happens very often in occupied buildings and inner city buildings as well, where people face evictions because there isn't a formal lease agreement or legal recourse available to them. So there's multiple things that need to be considered when it comes to legal protection of tenants, and this is a huge topic that needs to be explored because it just has too many repercussions at the moment.
I hear your call for evictions to be made illegal, but would that actually change what happens on the ground in the informal sector that you refer to? Would it actually stop evictions from happening?
Well, it's not just the only call. I think it has to be supplemented with some kind of reassurance and support and advocacy, public statements that need to come out both from political figures, national, provincial, local, that appeal to landlords not to do evictions at this particular moment. And that has to be, both of these have to be supplemented together. The law coupled with some reassurances that the income loss would somehow either be covered or appealing to just basic humanity that this shouldn't be happening at the moment.
Okay, let's talk about the sort of much bigger issue that you point to, which is the chronic shortage of housing, the chronic shortage of accommodation in urban areas near jobs. There are ways to fix this. I mean, we had during the big conversation around the expropriation of land 18 months ago, we were told specifically in Gauteng that government-owned land, all of it, would suddenly be made available, service stands, people would be able to buy homes. I don't see much evidence that any of that has happened so far.
Very little to show, Stephen, on that particular issue. I mean, our organization has been in formation since 1986. Our first publication in 1993 spoke about the Defence Forces land, Youngsfield, Wingsfield, located in Cape Town, that was supposed to be released for housing back in the day, for high density affordable housing. That issue is still being debated 2.5 decades post that time. I mean, this is the fundamental issue, that we have to bring that land into play at the moment, both as a response to COVID-19, but also as a medium to long-term solution for the housing crisis that we're facing. We cannot revert back to business as usual. I mean, implementation just has been too slow around the release of land, around the provision of housing in well-located areas. And this has to be the highest priority if we have to protect people living in informal settlements, backyards, reduce the level of both land invasions and evictions that are taking place at the moment.
Why has this not happened? I mean, everybody seemed to think this was the big new thing. This was what was going to, remove land hunger. It was going to remove some of the impetus around certain debates. This is an important thing. You talk about going back to 1993. Are there entrenched interests? Is there just inertia? Just people talk about it but not actually do it? Is there something sort of quite strange to explain this?
I mean, it's a mystery that we're all trying to figure out around, Stephen. It does seem that the law allows for these kind of transactions to happen between different government entities and parastatals and different spheres of government. But it doesn't materialize ever in the favor of, and it's hard to decipher whether this is actually a legislative issue or is it a political issue. And that's the real core of this. It has to be resolved through the legislative process and has to be prioritized. Very little money has been allocated to this kind of process. Very often, many of the parastatals do not have a planning function or a function that deals with their land assets and so on. And so this land assets just keep sitting and wasting away while we have a housing crisis that's mounting. That's probably the worst in the world at the moment.
There has been big changes to housing policy. There was a time when there was a promise that people would get free houses. We're one of the only countries in the world to make that promise, if I remember correctly. And now it seems that there's been a big change, that people who are, I think the phrase was able-bodied, between 20 and 40 would not get would not get free houses. They would get help to build their own. Is that something you support, or do you think government is absolving itself of its responsibility?
Look, there's just no way in the characteristic of the people living in informal settlements and backyards that people will be able to build their house without any form of support. There has to be some kind of a program that is structured on providing either financial support and technical support to people. But look, all the informal settlements that have been built up across the country have been built by people. It's not as if people do not know how to build. Our cities are defined by the people that have created occupied land and built structures on top of it. So the solutions are already there. It's about the right enabling mechanisms and incentives that are offered to people to be able to formalize these particular structures over the long term. There are many other countries across the world, in Asia, in Brazil, in many other countries, that have demonstrated where a people-led process, a people's housing process, has led to long-term solutions to informality, informal settlements, backyards, and so on. So yes, definitely we support that approach, but not without the right support mechanisms.
Ali Kumar, I do appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed. Executive Director at the Development Action Group's big conversation to have around evictions, around accommodation, around simply creating enough housing stock, enough rental housing in the housing market, next to work opportunities, next to jobs in cities.